There's someone right now sitting alone in a quiet room, scrolling through their phone, switching between apps, checking nothing in particular, just passing time. And if you ask them how they feel, they'd probably say they're fine. Maybe even say they enjoy the peace. Because after all, there's no drama, no pressure, no one to answer to. But what they won't tell you is how heavy that silence feels when it stretches too long. When the day ends and there's no one to share it with. When the room stays exactly the same, no matter what happens inside their mind. Because silence doesn't always feel like peace. Sometimes it feels like absence, like something that should be there but isn't. And the longer you sit in it, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between choosing to be alone and simply getting used to it. And that's exactly where many older Gen X individuals find themselves today, living a life that looks stable and controlled on the outside, but carries a quiet, psychological weight underneath. Gen X was raised in a way that shaped this outcome long before they even realized it. They grew up learning independence early, often coming home to empty houses, handling responsibilities on their own, figuring things out without emotional guidance, and over time that created a mindset where relying on others felt unnecessary, even uncomfortable. So instead of building lives centered around connection, they built lives centered around self-sufficiency. Now fast forward decades later, and that same self-sufficiency has turned into a lifestyle, where living alone doesn't feel strange, it feels normal, even preferable, because everything is predictable, everything is controlled, and there's a certain comfort in knowing that nothing unexpected will disrupt your space, your time, or your emotions. A typical day reflects this perfectly, waking up without interruption, moving through routines that require no negotiation, eating when you want, doing what you want, structuring your entire day around your own preferences. And on the surface, it looks like freedom. A kind of life many people say they want, because there are no conflicts, no compromises, no emotional demands from anyone else. But here's where the psychology becomes deeper, because while control creates comfort, it also removes something essential, which is connection. And the human mind, no matter how independent it becomes, is still wired for interaction, for being seen, for sharing experiences, even if that need becomes quieter over time. The problem is that Gen X doesn't always express that need directly. They weren't taught to openly talk about emotions or ask for support, so instead of saying, "I feel disconnected," they adapt in ways that hide it, filling their time with routines, distractions, and habits that keep them mentally occupied just enough to avoid confronting what's missing. Work becomes more than work, hobbies become more than hobbies, even simple activities like watching videos or scrolling endlessly become tools to pass time without feeling the weight of silence. And over time, this creates a pattern where life feels full on the surface, but empty underneath. And this is where a subtle psychological shift happens, because the brain starts to normalize this state. It stops recognizing the absence of connection as a problem and starts accepting it as reality, which makes it even harder to change, because you can't fix something you don't fully acknowledge. Many Gen X individuals also built their social lives around a very small circle, a partner, a few close friends, maybe family, but not large, active networks. So when those connections fade due to time, distance, or life changes, there's often nothing replacing them, and rebuilding new connections later in life feels difficult, unfamiliar, and sometimes even unnecessary. So instead of reaching out, they wait, and waiting turns into distance. Distance turns into silence, and silence slowly becomes a permanent part of their daily experience. Not because they consciously chose isolation, but because it gradually formed around them. Daily habits reinforce this even more, repeating the same routines, the same schedules, the same patterns every single day, creating a sense of stability that feels safe, but also limits opportunities for change. And connection always requires change, whether it's starting a conversation, meeting someone new, or opening up emotionally. But change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is something deeply independent individuals tend to avoid because it disrupts the control they've spent years building. So they stay within what's familiar, even if it means sacrificing deeper connection. What makes this even more complex is that many of them don't feel obviously lonely. It's not a dramatic or overwhelming emotion. It's subtle. It shows up in small moments, like having no one to share a thought with, no one to react to a small achievement, no one to simply acknowledge their presence at the end of the day. These moments don't feel urgent, but they accumulate over time, creating a quiet sense of emotional distance that's easy to ignore but difficult to fully escape. And because it doesn't feel extreme, it rarely gets addressed. The deeper truth is that even the most independent person still has a natural desire to be understood. Not constantly, not intensely, but enough to feel connected to something outside of themselves. And when that connection is missing, the mind adapts. But adaptation doesn't always mean fulfillment. So the real psychological tension isn't about whether living alone is good or bad, it's about balance. Because independence without connection can slowly turn into isolation, and connection without independence can feel overwhelming. And finding the balance between the two is what determines whether someone feels truly at peace or quietly disconnected. This is why the question isn't simply, do they like living alone, but rather, have they built a life that no longer requires connection? Because once a life is structured that way, change becomes difficult, not impossible, but uncomfortable enough to avoid. And that's where awareness becomes important, because recognizing these patterns is the first step toward understanding them, and understanding them is what creates the possibility for change, even if that change starts small. So if you're watching this and something feels familiar, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but quietly relatable, then it's worth asking yourself one simple question. Is your solitude something you actively choose, or something you've slowly adapted to over time without realizing it? Because that answer reveals more about your life than anything else. And sometimes, the difference between peace and loneliness isn't how your life looks on the outside, but how it feels in the quiet moments when there's nothing left to distract you. If this made you think a little deeper than usual, subscribe to Psychology Explained, because the quietest lifestyles often carry the most powerful psychological stories.